Good evening to those bored enough to watch. When discussing things correlating to video games, such as reviews or generally discussing a topic relating to them, I've made an effort to mention the concept of replayability in parts of which I saw fit. This is mainly due to the fact that I think that the concept of replayability is what makes a game, and then one of the aspects of which gives the game the ability to age well. As I'll discuss in due course, I think that replayability is an important concept of which is built on many different foundations. I think it's an important concept because it's one of the many factors of which gives the player a reason to return to the game, and it also gives the game the ability to maintain a lot of different things, such as a positive reputation, which in turn allows for said game to maintain an active player base, as well as maintaining entertainment value should the game implement different factors of which encourage the player to return. Replayability can be a tricky aspect of a game in terms of development. When in the midst of incorporating such a thing into a game, one must consider many different things, such as how the player would feel coming back to the game on their second playthrough of said game. Will the player enjoy returning to the game? Will the player feel as though that the game is beginning to turn tiresome on repeat runs of the game? Is adding an element in regards to replayability perhaps too much or too little? These, among a multitude of different other things, are things that one must consider while working such a concept into their game. There are a multitude of different factors of which make a game replayable, such as the gameplay, story, extra content, and much more. In this video, I intend to discuss what makes a game replayable. I want to discuss how the incorporation of such a thing contributes to a game's ability to maintain things like an active player base, and maintaining entertainment value before ultimately providing a conclusion, where I intend to provide my overview on the importance of replayability. So, with that said, let's discuss the concept of replayability. As many of us know, there are a multitude of different things that can make a game replayable. Such a thing tends to be subjective, given how in most cases even the smallest of things can leave a lasting impression on the player and influence their decision to return. What one would otherwise turn a blind eye to and think that it doesn't leave much of an impact, another may return to the game solely for that thing. However, after giving this some thought, I picked out three concepts: gameplay, story, and extra content. As I discussed in my video about old games, I think that the element of gameplay is essential to the concept of replayability, as it's one of the elements of a game that distinguish it from other forms of media such as movies and the sort. And for that reason, the game needs to be enjoyable in one of its core, distinguishable and essential elements that make a game: the gameplay. You see, a game can have a multitude of different positive elements going for it, yet should it fail in one of the most fundamental aspects of said game, then it simply wouldn't encourage the player to return, and if anything it would simply deter the player from doing so, as they may not want to deal with the bad gameplay a game would perhaps have. With the procedure of time, a lot of developers have taken the creative liberty of including stories in their video games. Such a thing generally tends to be important to leaving a long-term impact due to the fact that if done right, it can be one of the many things that influence the player's decision to return, as there are many things that the player would recognize on their second playthrough as opposed to their first, such as foreshadowing, of which can be seen in the storytelling of the game, or the symbolism of which can be seen in some aspects of the game such as the position of characters in cutscenes, or the dialogue of said character in said game, all of which can be appreciated more in the player's second playthrough of the game. Some things also generally tend to build more suspense in the game's story due to the fact that we, as the player, know what is going to occur in the later events of the story. We can appreciate things more in the second run of the game's story, such as the time spent with a certain character, due to the fact that we, on the second run, would know what occurs to them later in the story. Another way in which a game would be replayable is through the extra content a game may implement for the player to indulge in after completing the main game. Such a thing may encourage the player to return to the game to complete this because of the satisfaction of doing so after beating the main game. This feeling can be aided further with some games rewarding the player for doing such a thing. This allows for the player to appreciate the game and enjoy it more, further adding to the replayability of said game. The following of which I've discussed in this part are what I think to be the most essential parts to making a game replayable. I think it's integral that these factors should be implemented into a game as they heavily contribute to the enjoyability of them. Of course, there are many things of which make a game replayable. As I said earlier, such a thing tends to be subjective as there are many different things that one may appreciate about a game. However, these are what I personally think is integral. The concept of replayability is so important due to the fact that it encourages the player to return to it, which in turn allows for the game to maintain a multitude of different things, such as an active player base and entertainment value. However, first let's discuss the former. So, let's discuss how the concept of replayability contributes to the game's ability to maintain an active player base. In a sense, all games, regardless of age, have a player base of some sort, due to the fact that in most cases, there will always be a small percentage of people of whom will return to the game for the purpose of replaying the game, due to the fact that it's one that they enjoyed. As many of you have guessed, this is due to the concept of replayability, a concept of which heavily contributes to a game's ability to maintain a player base. As I mentioned earlier, regardless of how widely known a game is, it will always have a player base of some sort. Concept of replayability contributes to a game's ability to maintain an active playbase due to the fact that the game will continuously have something to return for, whether that may be the gameplay or something else of that sort. If you were to ask someone what their favorite aspect of a game was, the answer would vary, ranging from gameplay to story, or perhaps the extra content. The reason this concept is so important is due to the fact that every game needs to be able to maintain some level of relevancy, regardless of what generation you may have been in. A player base, regardless of whether it's a big or small one, is essential to keeping a game alive. Overall, an active player base is essential to keeping a game alive, as I mentioned earlier, and the concept of replayability greatly aids a game's ability to maintain an active player base. However, the concept of replayability also allows for a game to maintain another thing, and that's the entertainment value of said game. So, let's discuss that now. One of the foundations that the entertainment value of a game is built upon is the things that there are to do in the game. It's obvious that playing the same game over and over with little differentiation will eventually get boring. To counter this, the game needs to be able to give the player things to do even after completing the main game. This is where the concept of extra content comes into play. You see, after completing the main game, the player is generally provided with incentive to come back and complete the game's extra content. A lot of developers generally tend to zero in on this concept and implement things that provide the player with incentive to return. Ultimately, this allows for the game to increase and maintain its entertainment value. This is because of the fact that the game maintains its enjoyability. Players can still return to the game and find an enjoyable experience to be packed within due to the game's extra content. To some extent, I think games should be designed with extra content in mind, due to the fact that I think such a thing generally tends to be one of the many factors that encourage the player to return to the game. It allows for the player to continue to have fun with the game even after the main game is completed, and it allows for the player to remain entertained throughout their possibly extended playtime. Overall, I think that the concept of replayability allows for a game to maintain its entertainment value, and the reasons I have for believing as such is now clear. I think that, if done right, it can allow for a game to keep a player entertained throughout the duration of their playtime. I believe I've discussed everything I want to in this video, so I think it's time to wrap things up. So, with that said, let's conclude things then. Overall, I think that the concept of replayability is essential to a video game. As I discussed in my video about old games, I think that it's one of the most prominent ways in which a video game ages, but that's besides the point. The concept of replayability is built upon many different foundations, of which I discussed in this video. Gameplay, story, extra content, and so much more. This concept allows for players to return to the game even after playing the main game and still have an enjoyable experience. It allows for the increase in maintenance of the game's entertainment value, both during and after the playthrough of the main game. It also allows for a game to maintain an active player base for long durations of time. I think that the concept of replayability is important due to the fact that a game should settle to do more than just leave a lasting impression, but more rather, it should also settle on giving the player a reason to return. As I alluded to earlier, I think that a game should settle to do many things, one of them giving the player a reason to return. And one of the ways in which a game can do this is through allowing for the player to engage in things like extra content and the sort, so that they can continue to enjoy the game even after completing the main game. In the end, what makes a game replayable is subjective. It can range from a lot of different factors, such as gameplay, story, or extra content, among many other things. So, there's the video. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you've all been enjoying the longer videos I've been putting out recently. I've been enjoying making them thus far, and I don't plan on stopping with the longer stuff anytime soon. I have got a few video essays brainstormed, but there are a few other videos I want to work on before getting to actually working on those. If you want to follow me, then my socials will be linked in the description, as well as any afterthoughts or messages I may want to add. With that, I've not really got much else I want to say, so I'll see you all in my next video. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and I wish you all a very pleasant evening.